Hello and welcome to this video. My name's Barry Beckham. Let's talk photography and image editing. Here's a fact. The less you're able to achieve at the time you press the shutter button means the more you have to do in your image editing. If you enjoy my videos and their content, please consider subscribing to my YouTube channel, and if you hit that notification bell, you'll be informed whenever I post new content. You'd also do me a great favour if you could pass on details of my YouTube channel and my website to any of your photographic friends, be they in a camera club or elsewhere. The author here was on a riverboat trip, but it was one of those trips which offered an evening meal on the boat. So the bulky SLR equipment was left at home, and the author just took a little compact camera, a Canon G15. Then they were faced with a pretty good scene like this, with very few modern distractions. Now, we don't get this opportunity very often, because there's usually a modern car or something to spoil the authenticity of the old riverboat. But with few exceptions, this could have been taken 100 years ago. Now, I think that the author treated the Canon G15 as a point, shoot and forget camera for that particular evening. But of course it has all the same issues with regard to contrast and exposure as our SLRs do. Now, the sky here is way overexposed to the degree that it's completely lost detail. That's happened because the camera has exposed for the shadows. If you look at the picture, 3/4 of it is generally a lot darker than the sky. So the camera has seen that dark area, made its calculation and given the exposure for that area. You could argue that that's not a bad thing, but we have to pay the price in that sky. Could anything be done about it? Maybe we could have given slightly less exposure so the sky wasn't quite burnt out as it is, and possibly automatic exposure bracketing. But we have to bear in mind that the author here was on a moving boat, and we may have had some issues with aligning 3 separately exposed images. Now, we're faced with an image here which is worth some effort, but we are going to have to put some work into it to make something from it. Fortunately, the image was shot as a RAW file, so we've got the latitude of that to fall back on. Now, the Canon G15 shoots an image which is 4:3 aspect ratio. So I think we can start with a crop. If I select my crop tool from the toolbox on the top right, I can lose a little bit of that sky. So that's going to make things a little bit easier, and a bit from the bottom too. You can see that the composition of the image is pretty good. But I don't think I want to lose anything on the width, either from the left or the right. So I'm going to hit the Enter key and Control 0 to fit this image on screen. Because we've lost so much detail in the sky, I'm not sure it's worth any effort at all in us trying to bring back any of that detail to a great degree. Now, I already have the optics set. That's done by default to remove chromatic aberration and use profile corrections. This particular lens has this built in, but it doesn't hurt if the box remains ticked. So I'm going to begin with the basic tab. First thing I'm going to do is to bring down some exposure on the highlights. Let's drop them way down. And we see a little detail coming in the sky, but I'm trying to bring down the boat. Let's bring up the shadows for those sheds in the background, and now I can tweak the exposure down until I get something which I think looks pretty good. Before I go too far though, I'm going to drop down and take a look at just spreading the whites a little bit You can see over here we've got a little spike up there, but that's all of this white area in the sky. We can effectively ignore that. We could afford to move this a little bit more to the right. You can see the histogram stretching to the right, and maybe even the blacks a little bit to the left. Everything's looking much better now. Let's step up the clarity as well, and maybe even a bit of vibrance on the boat, especially on the water. So we've got a nice combination here of the blue tones of the old corrugated iron and the warm tones of the boat. To get the image down that far, I think I've gone a little too far with the vibrance. I think maybe I'm blocking up the shadows a little bit, but I'll make a decision on that when I've looked at it for a few moments. There's not a great deal more we can do, I think, overall. So we've done the global editing, and now we need to think about the more strategic editing. But just looking at the image, maybe I'll just try bringing that down just a little more. In normal circumstances, if we was looking to improve the sky, we would select the graduated filter. I'm going to do that anyway, but I know it's not going to have a good impact on the sky. But it may hold in the top of the shed and the trees on the left and right. So I'm going to select my gradient filter, and I'll drag it down from the top. I'll keep the same angle as the dock. I'll right click within it and reset it, and then touch the V key. If I bring the exposure completely down, you can see that we cannot bring detail into the cloud here, and that's why the white area has just gone that muddy grey. But I can ignore that and just affect the top of that shed, just bringing that down. Maybe I'll warm it slightly as well, just take off some of that blue, and of course it's helping at the top left with that tree. But I think we could do with a gradient filter, maybe on the bottom, even maybe the left and right, although perhaps we could use a radial filter for that. So touching the V key, I'm going to go down to the bottom, click and drag again. As you can see, I'm dragging up at the angle of the boat. So I want a nice solid base here, but as always, I'm going to go back into the bounding box, right click and reset it, because once I hit the V key to hide that, I do like to add the changes to the graduated filter generally differently from the top one I've just applied. Sometimes that's not the case, but most of the time I find it is. So I'm going to come down a little bit. Maybe I'll warm a little bit more in the water because it was rather muddy water there. Let's have a look at bringing down some of the highlights down in that bottom right corner. Maybe a little more in the exposure. Now we're focusing nicely on the boat. So maybe we do have a little bit of a light area on the back of the boat, but that's not important, I think, because the boat's looking left. It's the left side that's more important. So once again, if I touch the V key, just so you can see what I'm about to do, by dragging in another graduated filter from the left. Now, I've got to decide how far I'm going to go. Right click and reset, touch the V key to hide, because all I really need here, I think, is a little bit of exposure. Maybe I'll take the highlights down. And now I'm seeing that I think I do need one on the right hand side. So I'm just going to do it, but a little bit lighter maybe. Maybe I'll just bring off those highlights a little bit. Now I'm going to go back to my normal tabs here and just have a couple of minutes to take a look at the image. And as we look around the image, we can see that there's very little to tell us that this was shot only a few years ago. There's nothing parked in the dock. The only thing I can see is a plastic bucket on top of one of the posts. And if that's a problem, well, that's not going to be difficult to remove. There's one or two little distractions, but apart from that, I'm willing to just look at the image for a few moments and decide where I go from here. Now, after looking at the overall scene, I'm just wondering if I need to use my adjustment brush just to darken down some of the yellow on the boat. Now, if you look at the options here, I've got the feather for this brush set quite high. There you can see the brush. The flow is down to 6. That may be a bit heavy, but we'll start there. I can leave the highlights drop down and maybe drop the exposure just a little bit. And then just brush over this area just to tone it down a touch. And just above as well. Not too difficult to do, and if I want to increase that, then of course I can drop it down even more. And I think I'm quite happy with that. Again, it's a small change which just really indicates it's a personal preference rather than an absolute right or wrong. I suppose we could make an argument that we may want to lift the tones in the dock area here. And again, if we wanted to do that, go to the top of your brush options here, hit the little plus to start a new brush, and here we're going to need to lighten the shadows and raise the exposure. So let's reset the highlights and the exposure. We'll bring the shadows up, a little bit of exposure up, and we'll take a look at the effect we have if we just brush over this area. Not having a massive effect, let's try just a little more. And that's looking a bit better. Just a little bit of detail perhaps, but again, more personal than anything else. What I think I'll do next is to open this up into Photoshop. Now we're going to be opening this as a smart object. You can see that on the button down at the bottom right. What's a smart object and how do we select that? If you go to the hyperlink at the center bottom of this screen and click, there's the option we're looking for. Open in Photoshop as a smart object. And the reason I've always got that selected is when I do open this up into Photoshop, anytime I want to come back into Camera Raw and make a change, I can. And while I'm talking, I just realized that I've forgotten one last thing. Now, what I wanted to look at was the noise, because we're working on an image here which is not quite the high resolution I'm used to. It's a few million pixels short of the cameras I'm currently using. So I'm going to go back to my basic tab and then down to our detail. Holding the control key, I'm going to click and drag to have a look at this image. And we do have a reasonable amount of noise, but we do have to bear in mind we're zoomed here to almost 300%, so that's considerable. Let's just bring the noise up to 20 or 30. I think that's going to do pretty well. So I'm hitting Control 0 and now I'm going to open this up into Photoshop. Now throughout the manipulation here I've said that I'm basically going to ignore the sky, but I didn't exactly say what I was going to do. Well, we're going to replace it. I'm going to use one of the newer tools in Photoshop for 2021. I'm going to go to my edit menu, top left of the screen, and choose Sky Replacement. Now, this filter does give us a number of skies to use. And if we go to this option here, you can see we've got blue skies supplied to us. We've got spectacular skies supplied to us, along with sunsets. But if I'm going to put an image or sky into an image, even if the image isn't mine, I still want to use my own skies. Now I've got one here which I've just selected, and I think that sky would work pretty well. But just to give you a little look at this new filter, I've prepared a sky that I want to try, and I've just dropped it on my desktop as a JPEG. So I'm going to go to the little plus sign here. I'm going to go and get that sky. There it is. Open that. I've just called it sky for speed, and there it is, and there you can see it. Can I move this out of the way? There you can see the sky. I could change back to the blue and see if that looks better. To be honest, I think it probably does. So I prepared this one as a special sky, but we can move things around. I can click into the sky and move it around to just affect the part that I want. So if I wanted something like that, I could. You get the idea. But I think just by pure chance, one of the other skies seems to fit remarkably well. So I think what we'll do here is output this. I'm going to stay with that sky. I'm going to output this and just say, give me a duplicate layer. Okay. So now I've got my original and I've got the one we're working on here. We've got a couple of little marks in the sky. To be honest, the next job was going to be to pick up my healing brush. So why don't I start there and just touch those couple of areas. Then I'm going to look around for some of the things which I think are mildly distracting. Going down to the bottom left, I'm going to zoom in a little bit. There's some areas here which I don't like. I don't like light areas right along the edge. They're distracting. This sort of thing is what I have in mind, and the spot healing brush deals with these things very well. Looking around the image quite carefully. Whether you want to do something with that red bucket or not, I don't think we can tell that it's plastic. We're probably guessing. There's a white poster just behind that fence, which I think I'll give a touch. There's a little bit over to the left I saw earlier on. There's a little sign there which I think needs a touch, and maybe something there. So Control 0, and I think it wouldn't hurt if we had just a few moments to look around the image in case there was anything else we feel needs to be done. Maybe a little local burning on the left hand side. So if I go back to my toolbox and select my burn tool, I'm going to select mid-tones. I've got an exposure of about 10%. So over on the left hand side here, we've got a little bit of the mud by the river, I think, just peeking up, so I'll deal with that. Maybe that dirt on the left could go down, although we may need to change to shadows to affect that. I'm going to go to my highlights now, change the setting, because up on the left hand side we've got some highlights among the trees which we can just subdue a little bit, not much, just to take it away from being so dominant. And then maybe I'll switch to dodge and highlights again and just wipe over these areas here, just to lift that little bit of cloud, just to make it look a little more natural. I thought it looked a little dull over on the right hand side. There you go. One of the issues we often have to grapple with when we're manipulating images like this, we're doing a number of different stages, and often knowing when to stop is an important point. There's just one last thing I'd like to take a look at. We've got a couple of little red spots here and there in the image, and I'm wondering, should we make just a little more of those, and maybe even the rusty top of that shed at the top of the dock? Well, we can try that without any risk. I'm going to go to my toolbox and pick up my sponge tool. From the options at the top of the screen, I've got saturate selected, and the flow is 10%. So what I can do on that roof, I'll zoom in just a little bit, I think. All I wanted to do was drop my brush size down a little bit, but maybe just bring up those rusty parts just a little bit. As always, it's not a lot of work we have to do, just a little, but maybe a little bit here and a little bit there. Now, given the red areas, I can make my brush slightly smaller, and I can just give a boost to that red bucket. We'll say it's not a plastic bucket, it's an authentic metal bucket from 1900 and goodness knows when. There's a little bit of red there, and that's a bit of a giveaway. It's orange actually, and we all know that that's plastic, but we'll get away with that too. We've got a bit of red piping around the boat, control 0, and also the flag I thought may be something I'd want to have a look at. As you can see, I'm not pushing the colour up massively here. It's just a little bit here and there. Not forgetting, of course, to save this as a Photoshop file as you go through the process. Now I've done that, so I'm quite happy now to go to the top right of the screen to flatten the image, and I've been working with a 16-bit image all through. So what I tend to do is to go to my image menu, mode, and reduce to 8-bit for saving as a Photoshop file, beg your pardon, a JPEG file for my finished image, saving it at level 12. Now as we look back at the original image, I suppose we could make the argument that exposing for the shadows, especially when we see the image we've created, wasn't a bad thing to do. But on this occasion it was done by accident rather than by design. So when we're looking at the final image like this, it is nice to know that the software we're using is capable of restoring an image which, at first glance, may appear to be past its sell-by date. Now if you'd like to stay with me just for a few more seconds, we're going to look at one or two derivatives, and I'll put up a label to show you what was used. I'll see you next time.